If you're familiar with video games on almost any level, then you've probably at least heard of Sega's collapse and the discontinuation of their console development at the turn of the century. But what you might not know is that the pieces for that were all put in play almost a decade earlier, back when their blurry blue mascot was running around at the speed of sound by himself. Oh, sorry, I got somewhere to be, but if you come along with me, I will tell you all about how Sega woke up from their Dreamcast. Now, if you want to understand how this whole thing got started, we actually have to go all the way back to the Genesis to see how that wound up influencing everything all the way to the fall of the Dreamcast. In the summer of 1990, while Sonic the Hedgehog was still in development, Sega CEO Hayao Nakayama hired Tom Kalinske as CEO and president of Sega of America with a 4-point plan. Lower the price of the Genesis, form an American team to develop American-geared games, build an aggressive ad strategy, and sell Sonic. The board of directors in Japan disapproved, but Nakayama was insistent with Kalinske and told him to press on regardless. Now, Kalinske had previously brought Barbie and Hot Wheels back from the dead, built the Masters of the Universe brand, and was the CEO of Mattel and later Matchbox, so it seemed like a pretty solid bet. And it worked! The Sega Genesis was a massive success, selling over 30 million units over the span of its lifetime, triple the numbers that the Master System or the Game Gear would ever produce. As the brand began to pick up steam, they started working on a plan for a successor to the Genesis, meant to compete directly with the looming SNES CD being worked on as a joint effort between Nintendo and Sony. However, when those negotiations broke down, Sony announced the PlayStation as a solo venture, unnerving Sega, who now had 3 rival companies to deal with.
See, at the same time all this was going on, Sega decided to invest in some console add-ons in an attempt to avoid being overtaken by a surprising third rival, Atari.
Back in the days of 2D gaming, the console wars were all about bits. Every damn commercial seemed to emphasize bits, as if simply being a higher bit console inherently made the gameplay experience better. Atari Corporation took things to the next level with the release of the Atari Jaguar, which they marketed as the world's first 64-bit console. At the same time, the hot new shit in gaming was CD-ROM consoles and add-ons. Along with the SNES CD, there was the PC Engine CD-ROM 2, the TurboGrafx CD, the Commodore CD-TV, and the Philips CDI. Even Atari would end up getting in on it with the Atari Jaguar CD. So Sega ordered up a CD add-on for the Genesis and didn't tell Sega of America about it. In fact, executive producer Michael Latham said that once they were told about it, they were routinely sent broken or intentionally underperforming equipment in order to ensure that information leaked to the public would be inaccurate, confusing Sega of America employees and sowing seeds of distrust on Western shores. Ultimately, the Sega CD was released, but only managed to sell a modest 2.25 million units, soon overshadowed by newer consoles like the 3DO Interactive Multiplayer. Seeing the writing on the wall, and with fears that the next console wouldn't be ready in time to take on the Atari Jaguar directly at the end of 1994, Sega instructed their American division to begin working on a 32-bit console codenamed Project Jupiter in January of that year, with the mandate that it be completed and shipped before the Christmas rush. It was a ludicrous idea, which Sega of America executive Joe Miller was able to help assuage by suggesting it be produced as another Genesis add-on instead, as developing an entirely new console in 6 to 9 months would be borderline impossible. Sega higher-ups were convinced, and so the Project Jupiter console was replaced with the Project Mars add-on, with a target release date of November 21st, 1994 in the US.
Unfortunately for Sega of America, things are moving pretty fast on the other side of the Pacific, and Sega of Japan wasn't really being super upfront with them still. What happened over the next 18 months resulted in the catastrophic failure of everything they had built up.
See, Project Saturn was being worked on since 1992 and was taking a small eternity to produce. Sega of Japan initially intended for it to be a 2D multimedia device, as most of the gaming world was at the time. But with the development of Virtua Fighter, Sega's internal studios started thinking hard about a transition to 3D instead. While they kept chipping away at it, they started to notice in 1994 that with both the CD and 32X add-ons, the Genesis and the Saturn were actually quite comparable in terms of hardware capabilities, which was really not a good thing for your follow-up system. So Sega just slapped a second graphics card and a second CPU on there and called it done. And then they went and did the unthinkable. In the early part of the year, after several months of grueling work by Sega of America on the 32X, Sega of Japan confirmed the Saturn would be released in its native country on November 22, 1994. Just one day after the 32X would debut in the West. The Japanese wing of the company had told the American wing nothing, leaving Sega of America to unveil the 32X at the 1994 Consumer Electronics Show as a transitional device, or a poor man's entry into next-generation games, with a price point of $159.99. It was pretty clear internally that this wasn't going to end well. Sega of America producer Scott Bayless said the move made Sega look greedy and dumb to customers. To make matters worse, the chips used in the 32X and the Saturn started to hit a shortage, and as would start to become a theme, Sega prioritized the Saturn over the 32X, leaving it even further behind. Likewise, game development for the system was becoming troublesome as well. The mad rush to get the add-on out by November on such short notice meant there needed to be games fast. By the fall of 1994, Sega promised 12 games at launch and 50 by the end of the following year from third parties. But because of the limited time frame, developers started cutting massive corners, desperately trying to get something onto the system while it was still a viable option, and it showed. While the November 21st launch was quite successful, there were some major hiccups. For one, over 1 million units were ordered, but only 600,000 actually got shipped, leaving customers already concerned about the 32X waiting around for the next batch. Meanwhile, the add-on launched with only 6 games available, and in some cases, as was the case with Cosmic Carnage, looked so awful that journalists took to outright mocking it in their coverage of the release.
Now, the Sega Saturn wasn't necessarily doomed from the start, but they were definitely going to need some killer apps to stay alive, and who better to do that than their own mascot, Sonic? So what they decided to do was try to go for a bit of a roundish sort of... Oh, hey dude.
What the hell are you doing here?
Oh, I just thought I'd stretch my legs, get out of the studio once in a while.
Are you filming?
Yeah, I'm doing a thing. I'm talking about how they needed a big like Sonic game in the '90s to kind of help revive Sega. And
Yeah,
make
like
sure
Sonic Adventure. I love that one.
Oh, I was kind of more talking about like before when they were on the Sega Saturn and the
Sega Saturn. What
Yeah.
was on? What Sonic game did that have?
well, that was kind of the whole point. Like they didn't get a good chance to do that before the Dreamcast came out,
So what's
Yeah.
the point then?
huh.
Look, the Saturn had way more problems than just one title, and even still, they would have needed it to be an extremely successful Sonic game to save the console. The console was fucked up from the ground floor. Its architecture didn't even use triangular faces for their 3D models, it used rectangles, which basically made porting 3D games from the Saturn a huge nightmare, and porting games to the Saturn borderline impossible.
And to make matters worse, Sega of Japan seemed to be dead set not to let Kalinsky make significant console decisions himself. He had approached Silicon Graphics to develop the base chip for the Saturn, which the company agreed to, but Sega's board shut down the idea, leaving Kalinsky hanging in the wind. Silicon Graphics had already devoted considerable time to developing their chip, and asked Kalinsky for advice on what to do now. Not wanting to leave them out in the cold, he suggested they get in touch with Nintendo, who in turn happily accepted their help, resulting in said chip being the basis for the Nintendo 64.
As all this was going on, third parties were running away from Sega like it was on fire. The 32X was losing developers constantly, as they considered it a dead end that Sega was already sweeping under the rug. By the spring of '95, both Capcom and Konami officially canceled their 32X projects in order to focus on the Saturn and the PlayStation.
Now, despite the Saturn's relatively stable launch in Japan, in the US it was anything but. In March of 1995, Kalinsky announced the Saturn would be launching on Saturn Day, September 2nd of the same year. And all the retailers were like, alright, cool man. But then, on May 11th, at the very first Electronics Entertainment Expo, he took the stage to announce not only that the console would cost $399, packed with a copy of Virtua Fighter of course, but that 30,000 consoles would be purchasable that day.
People lost their fucking minds. Some retailers flipped out and started selling any they had since they had already received their stock. Others, not expecting the release for another 4 months, had no stock at all and were furious. KB Toys, remember them, was so incensed by this move that they removed the Sega Saturn from their catalog, refusing to advertise it until the promised release date.
And that's to say nothing about the game developers. They too were left in the dark about all this and had practically nothing prepared for the early launch, leaving the Saturn with only 8 games until September came around, 6 of which were launch titles. The other 2 were both released in August: Bug and Street Fighter, the movie.
Presumably amused by the spectacle put on by Sega, Steve Race, manager of the PlayStation project, stepped on stage and simply said a number.
$299.
Sega was, in a word, fucked. They turned away the chip that would form the basis for the Nintendo 64, they refused to consider a team-up with Sony, whose PlayStation was gearing up to obliterate the market, and consumers, developers, and retailers alike were ripshit at the sloppy execution of the Saturn's launch.
To add insult to injury, yet another critical error likely kept Sega from recording much in the way of profits from there on out. Now, in 1995, 2D consoles still accounted for almost 2/3 of the video game market, and Sega somehow still had a hold on 43% of the market in the US. By the fall, the Genesis managed to sell over 2 million units worldwide, proving itself a stable competitor against consoles nearly a decade its junior.
However, Nakayama chose only to concern himself with the Japanese sales figures, showing the Saturn outperforming the PlayStation when he decided to discontinue every other console they had on the market as soon as possible. The Master System, Sega CD, and 32X were all discontinued in 1996, and the Genesis, Game Gear, and Nomad followed suit in 97. The last pre-Saturn console standing, against all odds, was the Sega Pico, which itself ended up discontinued in 98 everywhere but Japan, where its family of systems had new games developed until 2011.
I mean, unless you count Brazil's literal never-ending love for the Master System, which is still being sold at a faster rate than most modern consoles to this day. Good on you, Tectoy.
In the fall of 95, the 32X was being sold for as little as $99, and by the time it was officially dead, it could routinely be found for under $20. The massive drop in price, with no rebates or refunds in sight, brewed a significant amount of distrust in the consumer base, who seemed adamant to avoid Sega moving forward.
The 32X sales figures were never officially released, but the last known records show the 32X as not having even crossed 1 million units. The last reliable data shows it at just over 600,000. Only 40 games were ever released for the system, and 6 required the additional use of the Sega CD.
And that was not all of Sega's problems at the end of 95. When Sony released the PlayStation in the US on September 9th, it jumped ahead of the Saturn, which had a 4-month head start, in just 2 days. As 96 marched forward, Sega somehow held on to 38% of the US market, ahead of Nintendo's 30% and Sony's 24%, but the PlayStation was outselling the Saturn by miles. The Nintendo 64, with its Silicon graphics chip, was putting serious dents in it as well, and the reveal of Final Fantasy VII as a PlayStation exclusive, with a playable demo handed out at 96's inaugural Tokyo Game Show, the Saturn was, for all intents and purposes, dead in the water.
On July 16, 1996, Tom Kalinske announced his resignation, effective September of that year, to be replaced by Bernie Stoller, fresh from Sony's American offices, where he was known for being a bit of a draconian asshole. He notoriously instituted what was called his 5-star game policy, which on paper was meant to prevent subpar games from being released on the Saturn or any console, but in practice ended up allowing him almost limitless veto power for games he decided simply wouldn't sell. And what he decided simply wouldn't sell was the near entirety of 2D game development, despite it still being the dominant force in games at the time, and Japanese games imported to the US. The already pitiful sales of the console just evaporated entirely, and at E3 1997, while Sega was actively promoting Sonic Jam on the show floor, Bernie Stoller infamously stated that, quote, "The Saturn is not our future," and referred to the Saturn as a stillbirth.
The public's response to this came swiftly and strongly. By the fall, Sega's market share was a pathetic 12%, forcing Sega of America to lay off 60 of its 200 employees. In January of the following year, Hayao Nakayama resigned, replaced by Shoichiro Iramijiri, while Bernie Stoller moved up to the president of Sega of America. And that spring, when the 97 fiscal year ended, Sega posted their first ever annual loss, totaling roughly $300 million. And for 98, they once again lost $300 million, leading them to lay off over 1,000 employees, more than a quarter of their workforce.
This probably wasn't helped by the decision to discontinue the Saturn in all regions except Japan, leaving everyone outside Japan, and Brazil, with no Sega consoles being manufactured or distributed for over a year.
The Saturn ultimately sold 9.25 million units, less than the Genesis, less than the Master System, and less than the Game Gear. It, like the 32X, is roundly considered a commercial failure, but not for lack of trying. Despite the console's overall collapse, one element of the system's public image is still widely adored to this day. A hilarious, terrifying spokesman in the form of Segata Sanshiro. See, at the time, the Saturn's ad campaigns in the West were like, really fucking weird and unsettling. The 90s were pretty notorious for in-your-face, messed up shit, but Sega of America took it to an entirely new level of creepy. I don't know if it helped sell consoles, but I do know it didn't make me feel too safe.
But in Japan, things were different. Commercials hawking the console featured a grandmaster martial artist by the name of Segata Sanshiro, who would beat the fucking shit out of anyone who doesn't play the Sega Saturn.
The mascot was a parody of a hero of Japanese literature, a character created by Tsuneo Tomita named Sugata Sanshiro, who was even the titular character of Akira Kurosawa's very first film. Playing the role was Hiroshi Fujioka, best known at the time for playing Takeshi Hongo, the first Kamen Rider. Along with the slapstick abuse, he would often utilize his catchphrase, Sega Sanshiro, or you must praise Sega Saturn. This later served as an added pun when the white Saturn redesign launched in Japan, as Shiro also translates to white.
These commercials were fucking crazy. He lived as a hermit on a mountain where he trained by punching buttons and playing Sega Saturn, and when he threw people, they exploded. Twice. He even wound up having a theme song of his own, and if you want to get a good idea of how popular this guy was in Japan, it's worth pointing out that when Warner Music Group distributed the song as a single, it sold over 100,000 copies.
His storyline came to a head in his final ad, where he stops a missile fired by Sony and Nintendo from blowing up Sega headquarters as they finalize the upcoming Dreamcast. After jumping from the roof and catching the rocket with his bare hands, he rides that thing into space, Strangelove style, delivering his catchphrase one last time before it explodes, saving everyone else. I am serious, this is true.
Or not? In Sonic and All-Stars Racing Transformed, he actually turns up again, still riding that rocket, so I don't know. But as the ad came to a close, it pitched the final major release on the Sega Saturn, Segata Sanshiro Shinken Yugi, a game starring the man himself. He's been seen in brief cameos in a handful of other games, but he finally became playable once more in 2015's Project X Zone 2, where he takes on all sorts of fighters from various game franchises.
It can't be overstated just how much everyone loved Segata Sanshiro. And in the end, he maybe sort of didn't sacrifice his life to save the Dreamcast. So did it take?
Well, Sega was determined to make it work, so they spent countless hours trying to rebuild from the ground up a system that developers would adore in an effort to woo them back. They ensured that the console was extremely easy to program for and inexpensive to produce by using standard PC parts throughout, and used GD-ROM technology that could hold up to 1 GB as a compromise between using costly DVD-ROMs for games and using CD-ROMs whose capacity were so low as to require multiple discs for even moderately large games.
Perhaps the most important improvement of all for consumers, though, Sega promised a Sonic the Hedgehog title at launch, after 4 years without a proper appearance. And as the cherry on top, Microsoft even lent a hand in the console's development, including helping create consoles that ran on the Windows CE operating system.
The name and logo for the console were decided by way of a public competition, which was allegedly won by Kenji Ino of Warp Inc., though this has never actually been confirmed by Sega.
And when the console is turned on, the water droplet-like tones players are greeted with are those created by musician Ryuichi Sakamoto, who at the time was famous for having won an Oscar, Grammy, and Golden Globe for Best Original Score for the movie The Last Emperor, and would go on to be nominated for that same Grammy for The Revenant.
Interestingly enough, in terms of radio play, he's actually well known for his band Yellow Magic Orchestra releasing Behind the Mask in 1978. Which would end up being covered with original lyrics and a new accompanying melody by Michael Jackson in 1982. Though this remained unreleased until his posthumous album Michael in 2011, but we're getting off track.
Early on, Sega was so concerned about their damaged brand that they wanted to keep the company's name off the console altogether, like Nintendo would later do with the Wii, but Iramajiri was insistent that it stay, as a statement of confidence in the system.
And in May 1998, both the Japanese and American halves of the company would reveal the newly designated Dreamcast, along with its release date. At the Sega New Challenge conference on May 21st, the Japanese release date of November 27th was announced, while on May 27th, the day before that year's E3, Bernie Stoller unveiled the system with a fall 1999 release date, along with 20 to 30 games promised at launch. These announcements were soon paired with the reveal of Sonic Adventure in August of the same year.
The console launched on time in Japan and sold out its entire stock nationwide that same day, even with only 4 launch titles. By February, however, fewer than 1 million units were sold, and Sega was starting to sweat.
Overseas, Bernie Stoller was putting out fires of his own. Electronic Arts was haggling with him for exclusive rights to all sports games on the Dreamcast, but having just bought Visual Concepts, the team that would ultimately develop the now massive 2K series, Stoller said no, prompting EA to abandon the console entirely.
He did, however, work out a deal with Hollywood Video to set up console and game rentals in the months leading up to the famous $99.99 launch, and promised 15 games minimum when the day came.
However, Bernie wouldn't be able to see his plan to fruition, as by August 11th, Sega of America confirmed that he had been let go and was replaced with Peter Moore, who Stoller had hired himself from Reebok to work directly under him.
$99.99 came and was absolutely massive. The system had 18 games ready on day one, and over 225,000 units went out the door in under 24 hours, a record at the time. Within 2 weeks, they'd sold 500,000, and by November 4th, over 1 million consoles were in the homes of American gamers. By Christmas, Sega had sold over 1.5 million and reclaimed a respectable 31% of the US market share.
Today, the Dreamcast is considered the first console of the 6th video game generation, and had over a year's head start on the entire game industry. Phantasy Star Online ended up being a breakout hit that helped pioneer online console gaming, and Sega hit the ground running hard with new IPs like Crazy Taxi, Jet Set Radio, Shenmue, and Skies of Arcadia.
Jet Set Radio, woo! But the good days couldn't last forever. In early '99, prior to the launch of the Dreamcast, Sony announced the PlayStation 2, with so much stuff going into it, along with being fully backwards compatible, a first for home console gaming post-Atari. The Dreamcast looked obsolete before it even hit the shelves.
Granted, the PlayStation 2 would go on to sell over 155 million units and be the best-selling console of all time, so it's kind of hard to feel too sour about that. But when the PS2 was joined later in the year by Nintendo announcing their GameCube and even Microsoft announcing their debut console, the Xbox, things started to take a turn.
By the end of 1999, Sony owned over 60% of the market, and Sega posted $400 million in losses for both 98 and 99. If they could survive the launches of their new rivals, they felt they stood a chance of getting through the barrier of entry and holding on.
But at that point, the damage was done. The mistakes of the past just haunted Sega. They were losing billions of yen a year, and the Dreamcast wasn't enough to fix it.
And despite trying with all its might, it was going to take a miracle for the Dreamcast to save Sega.
Sega was just hemorrhaging money at this point, and the ideas they put on the table just cost them more and more and more. They started by offering a $200 rebate on the Dreamcast for anyone who bought 2 years of their Sega Net online service, then moved to slashing the Dreamcast price to $149, less than half of the PS2 altogether, and then ended up offering a full rebate on the console to anyone who bought 18 months of the $22 Sega Net service.
Peter Moore suggested that the Dreamcast would need to sell a whopping 5 million units by the end of 2000 to stay a viable option for Sega, but it wound up only scraping past 3 million, resulting in Sega once again posting $400 million in losses for the year. God damn it. How does a company have enough money to lose that much money?
By this point, it was all around abandon ship time. Sony owned 50% of the market, and even Nintendo had taken some back to end up with 35% itself, leaving Sega with less than a sixth of it to get by. Irimajiri was replaced as Sega president by Chairman Isao Okawa, who is well known internally for wanting to abandon hardware development altogether, which wasn't even all that unique a prospect at this point. Even Bernie Stoller was considering selling Sega to Microsoft outright at one point.
In September of 2000, during a meeting with a number of Japanese studio heads and company executives, Peter Moore recommended that they abandon hardware in favor of software, prompting the studio heads to walk out of the meeting. Things were looking grim.
Finally, on January 31st, 2001, Sega announced the discontinuation of the Dreamcast on March 31st, and their new life as a platform-agnostic third-party developer. The Dreamcast's price would wither away to $99, then $79, then even as low as $39 before the end.
The final Dreamcast manufactured was signed by the heads of each of the 9 internal development studios, as well as Visual Concepts and Wavemaster, and was given away with 55 first-party games in a contest held by GamePro magazine. Okawa, who had loaned Sega $500 million in the summer of 1999 to stay afloat, forgave that loan and returned his $700 million in stocks to Sega and CSK Holdings, which was ultimately the only thing that allowed Sega to survive the transition to third party. Sadly, very shortly after this, Okawa died of heart failure on March 16, 2001, a mere 2 weeks before Sega left the hardware business for good. So fucking sad.
Sega of Japan was forced to lay off over a third of its staff in 2001, and when they left the console scene, they were quickly replaced with their former business partners at Microsoft. Interestingly enough, Bill Gates had actually been discussing cross-platform online play with Sega, which could have potentially helped save them had they made it to that point. The Dreamcast sold a total of 9.13 million units before it was all over, and at the end of the 2002 fiscal year, Sega finally turned a profit again at long last.
In the end, Sega saw the writing on the wall and pulled the plug on all their consoles after the failure of the Dreamcast.
Which itself was a result of the failure of the Saturn.
Which itself stole the thunder from the failure of the 32X.
And that only happened because Sega of Japan and Sega of America couldn't put aside their differences and stop being so damn insecure about the Genesis.
But 17 years later, Sega remains a powerhouse in the third-party circuit, and we are so excited to show you its bright future on consoles of all shapes and sizes.
We love them, they're near and dear to our heart, they're one of our favorites, and if we're lucky, there might be something nearby to help us show you.
Yeah, but until then, see you next time.
Let's pray.
よ。セガサタンしろ。セガタ三四郎は君たちの心に。セガサターン